A reading from Ezra 3:10 through 13. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments were stationed to praise the Lord with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals according to the directions of King David of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to the Lord. For he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever toward Israel. And all the people responded with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and head of the families, old people who had seen the first house on its foundations, wept with a loud voice when they saw this house, though many shouted aloud with joy, so that the people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping. For the people shouted so loudly that the sound was heard far away. Ezra 6:14 through 18. So the elders of the Jews built and prospered through the prophecies of the prophet Haggai and Zechariah, son of Iddo. They finished their building by command of the God of Israel and by decree of Cyrus, Darius, and King Artaxerxes of Persia. And this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. The people of Israel, the priests and the Levites and the rest of the returned exiles celebrated the dedication of this house of God with joy. They offered at the dedication of this house of God 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats, according to the number of the tribes of Israel. Then they set the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their course for the service of God at Jerusalem, as it is written in the book of Moses. This is the word of God.
Thanks be to God. Good morning, church. My name is Abby, and I'm a member and an elder, and now an occasional speaker here at Church Without Walls. And I'm pretty excited to get to speak during this specific little series that we're doing, in which we're doing half Zoom, all church meetings, and half in-person, smaller church pods. I think just spending 2 weeks kind of in each theme is really vital. It's really pretty exciting, and the kind of contrast of the people who get to lead and stuff. It's fun stuff. And then I'm also excited to be going back into the Old Testament, and especially into a fairly narrative-driven book. So that's why we kind of heard 2 little sections of this passage. So I'm actually going to kind of timeline you guys for the whole of Ezra 1 through 6. Sorry if this text is a little small. You can like drag your Zoom screen if you need to, but I tried to make it as big as was reasonably possible and could still be on one slide. So I'm going to outline the full 6 chapters, and then we kind of have these 2 passages that we read as checkpoints for the main structure of what we're going to focus on. But I'm going to first take us through this timeline. So obviously we started with Exile here. This series is after Exile. And the temple is the first thing, if you remember from kind of our background 2 weeks ago on this whole series through Ezra and Nehemiah. The first of the 3 sections we're going through is the temple, and then we'll later do the Torah and the walls. But they start with the temple. They start with rebuilding the temple because these exiles have been unable to worship in the presence of God for their entire exile without the temple. And they're still going to kind of remain unable to worship for a long time. So they arrive in Jerusalem and start this rebuilding. And then we see in that first passage that we read, Ezra 3, that's marked on that second little triangle below, that they do finish part of it. They finish the altar and the foundation, and they celebrate. But there's kind of this contrast, right, between joy and weeping. They recognize that the glory of the former temple is not totally met in this one, with equal joy and weeping is what it's described as, right? The joyful sounds could not be distinguished from the weeping, which is like, that's pretty stark, that it's equal. That's a difficult place to be. There's still some limits to the ways that they can worship, right? There's still some major ones. And then also we see more negativity here. We see opposition introduced, which we don't see in the text here, but basically, I mean, you did see it a little bit in the video from 2 weeks ago, that there were some people who still were in Jerusalem who had never been exiled, and they asked to help rebuild the temple. And Zerubbabel, who is the leader of the exiles, did not let them. And because of this kind of disagreement and opposition, those folks end up as like an enemy of the whole project. And they send a letter that's a little bit, it's a little bit slanderous, but it has some truth to it, where they're like, hey, Jerusalem is known for being like really rebellious. They send this to the king, who is a different king that originally sent them out of exile to rebuild. So that was Cyrus. Artaxerxes is the king now. And they send this to Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes sends a letter back and is like, oh, shoot, yeah, you're right. I see this history. I looked into my records. This is a rebellious city. I would like you to stop them from rebuilding. And so they are stopped in their tracks at this point. And there's a lot of time here. That's why I drew those timelines so big, because there's a lot of time that they spend still kind of crippled in their ability to worship God. Still paused here, where the temple sits half constructed. And then we get past that timeline. Eventually, we don't get a lot of details on that timeline, but what the next thing that happens is we see another letter that starts back up again, this weird little letter correspondence. And this letter is in response to the fact that Haggai, so a different book of the Bible that we read a little bit of last week, and we will read a little bit more of next week in our house church pods. So Haggai the prophet has this advice. It just basically calls the people, especially the people who noticed and who were very saddened, especially those of the exiles who were weeping at the foundation and the altar. It calls those people to begin rebuilding again. And they do. They don't actually have permission yet, but there is a new king. So when these governors who were originally in opposition, or maybe some different local governors, not totally sure because there's been a long time gap, they notice and are like, hey, you're not supposed to do this. And so they interrogate them, and they send another letter to this new king saying, hey, we noticed these guys started rebuilding and we interrogated them. And they said that they had permission. And so then King Darius, who is this next king, writes back, and he actually investigates. He investigates and he finds in his records that yes, they did originally have permission and a blessing from King Cyrus to do this rebuilding. And so he lets them keep rebuilding. And I think there's something really significant about this, which is that King Darius could have found Artaxerxes' orders to stop them building. But when he went back in to search his records, the thing that he found and the thing that he obeyed was King Cyrus's original permission and promise to help these exiles rebuild Jerusalem. So that's the thing that he acts on. And then he sends back this final letter of this section, giving full permission for the leaders of these exiles to continue rebuilding, even though they've already started. He gives them express permission and also commands the opposition, the local governors, to help. So that happens. It slowly happens. They take about 4 more years, and then we see our Ezra 6 passage where the temple is actually finished. So there's kind of some complicated things that we see happen. There's like, right, there's opposition, there's negativity, there's difficulty, there's weeping, and there's a lot of time. But what brings them out of it is prophecy, is strong leadership from Haggai, and then some kind of miraculous moments of bureaucracy. And I'm trying to then transfer here to think about what that means for us. How do we think about the way that, we've kind of been exiled to our homes for 18 months and been limited in the ways that we can worship, in the ways that really define CWOW worship. And I've done a lot of thinking about what it means to worship, and specifically what it means to worship, what it has meant to worship together at CWOW, partially because, I'm gonna tell a little story for this. So when technically my 3rd year in architecture school, but it was kind of my 2.5 year, I took a half-time year to get residency in Montana. And in that year, I was doing school half-time, so I didn't have a studio class, which that's the class where you usually do your like big design projects in. I didn't have a studio class, but I was taking this other graphics class that kind of required a studio project. Like it was designed to go along with the studio class. All my classmates were using their studio project, but I didn't have one. So I made one up. I had to pull one out of nothing. And what I decided to do was I decided to think about what a building would look like for CWOW. I don't have pictures of this, 1, because it was a long time ago, and 2, because it was not very good. So I apologize for that. I think what's more important are the ideas that I came up with in thinking about what it would mean to design a sacred space, especially for a church that believes so fundamentally that the church is the people, not the place. So I think when I was thinking around this, I was thinking a little bit metaphorically about like no walls, right? What does no walls mean? How do you have a building with no walls? Should I be literal about this? I was a little literal about this, but I think the more valuable thing is I was still pretty aware that we are wise about our wider community, the wider community in which we operate. And I think that we as Church Without Walls would want a building to be functional and useful for the things that we worship together. We used to worship together, the ways that we used to worship together every Sunday. And then also for the ways potentially an outside community could use that space. I was thinking now too, in depth about what that means. I was thinking like we need a big space to meet, of course, a big space to meet with good acoustics for singing. We like singing, we're good at that. We sing together, we meet together, we eat together. How do I have an eat together place too? Can we have them be sort of the same place reused? We tell stories to kids together. That's a big part of us, is having enough classrooms for the kids. We want a prayer spot too. We want a prayer spot where we can meet together, pray quietly, lay on hands, be a little bit separate from the louder, more celebratory parts of church. So these are all, we're all like the essential things of worship that I was thinking about for what CWOW needs. What is sacred to CWOW, how we worship together, singing together, meeting together, eating together, having children's church, laying on hands in prayer. And these are also all these central elements of worship that are mostly missing, that have been mostly missing for 18 months. And we've done a really kind of remarkable job of figuring out some kind of ways to build that back up without building it up in the same way, right? But those are big things to miss. And I think it was really important for me to recognize the way in which, like, joining together voices in worship hasn't been happening. And that's something I'm really missing. That is a detriment to the way that I worship, to the way that I think I connect with God, that this level of exile at home is exile. It is blocking us from forms of worship. Which, I mean, I'm clearly sad about this. This is, I think, something to mourn and to lament, and to weep about, like they were doing in Ezra here, like the exiles were doing in Ezra. But I think we also really want to learn from the ways that they spent that time, and then the ways that they got out of that time. And I also think that we're doing a few of these things already. So I'll kind of give you at the end a couple of ways that I feel like we're already starting to chip away at this with maybe some prophecy or some miraculous bureaucracy, and ways that we can keep leaning into that, to those forms of slowly building back up our center of worship together. Sorry, let me reorient myself here. I'm going into another phase. So we're kind of in this under construction phase. There's a big under construction phase here that happens as soon as there is opposition and the construction stops on the temple. And then all of this time until there is a prophecy in which a strong leader, Haggai, encourages the people to keep building. We're somewhere in there. We're somewhere in under construction. But I think that we will get to full celebration, and that's worthy of looking forward to. And I also think that we're a little bit better at doing a partial rebuild or still worshiping while we're under construction. Is the next slide the buildings? Yes. So I think I'm gonna get a little architecture nerd, have some architecture fun here. I think that historically the church has done a really great job of still worshiping while things are under construction. St. Peter's Basilica took like 300 years to construct. It took so long to construct that several parts of it are in different architectural eras, where in a time when architectural eras lasted hundreds of years. So the outside here that you can see of St. Peter's Basilica shows a ton of elements of Renaissance, mostly High Renaissance, which is the later era. It's got symmetry to it. It's got these like Grecian elements, right, with that triangle thing. And then the interior and the dome that you can see in the first picture, both of those are much more on the side of the Baroque era, especially this interior, right? You can see it's way more colorful. There's that really dark altar, this dark dramatic altar, which is a hallmark of the Baroque period, is a lot more darker colors, a lot more colors in general. And then the dome is a technological advancement that would not have been possible earlier on. That also is a hallmark of the Baroque, is these kind of technological experiments. So there's a building here that was under construction for many, many years and still used and still glorious during that time. But it's a little bit hard for us to see because it is completed now. But actually, my personal favorite cathedral in Europe that I have been to so far, which I have not been to all of them, is La Sagrada Familia, which is famously still under construction. There was a large amount of time where like a bunch of the plans were lost and stuff in during the Franco era. Really sad. Part of it was like torn down as well. So there have been some tragedies with this church, but it remains to be seen that the experience of going in there is glorious. It's amazing. I had a spiritual experience walking in there, and it was certainly still under construction. These are all pictures I took when I was there in 2017. You can see there's 3 construction cranes on the outside of it. They're still putting up a whole facade on the other side of this of the picture. The view, if you approach from the other direction, there's basically an entire facade that's very almost completely unconstructed. At least it was in 2017. I haven't seen it since then. And then this interior, the third interior photo you can see, at the very bottom, there's like a white line. I was trying to cut off the area that was under construction and also the area where you could start to see people's heads. So you can see the little tiny heads at the bottom there, and that little, that's an area that was under construction. That was like the interior of the church was being fixed, was being remodeled, but this is still a place of worship. This is still a place where you can totally meet God. And I think that we kind of need to think of our under construction phase as like something that we can use these strategies to start to rebuild our forms of corporate worship without necessarily going directly back to the way that we used to worship. So let's go forward to the timeline. Yeah. So again, to the timeline, that's where we are here. And it's a many years thing for them. And it's been a 1.5 year thing for us so far, being on Zoom. And I think we have been building during that time. So they actually had a complete construction stop. I think we have had a slow build, a build in a different direction, but a build in a direction that I think if we strategize properly, we can bring these things back. I think a build that shows a lot of good positive things. So one of the things that I've been talking about here is the prophetic advice through Haggai, which may seem a little bit weird. I think that we can see in our church as well some prophetic pushes that we can kind of use to rebuild our worship. That's the next one, Gary. Oh yeah, we're in that time, but we're looking for some prophetic push. We can look for a prophetic push, and we can look also, and we can pray also for God to intervene bureaucratically, right? There seems like a lot of the barriers to us really going back to worshiping together are totally out of our control, but that does not mean that they're out of God's control. And this quote here, "Nothing is impossible with God, even bureaucracy," is something that Maddie said to me a while ago, and it stuck with me. It feels important, and this is like a perfect example of it. It's a little silly the way it's said, but you know what? It's also true. Nothing is impossible with God, even bureaucracy. And I think we can be praying for that. We can keep praying that local authorities, national authorities, that national trends will be something that God can intervene in, for the world, but also to get us back to a place where we can worship again, to a place where every church in the US can feel safe, in the US, across the world, can feel safe going back in person to worship together, to join voices together, to lay on hands in prayer, all of those things that I mentioned that I think are big things we're missing. So let's kind of ask, in our situation, how can prophecy and bureaucracy help us out of this under construction season? So those are weird and scary words. I think the prophecy one, I think what actually happened here was a spiritual leader pushed the community to pursue growth through adversity. So I think earlier in the service, we already heard some stuff that could fall under this category. I think that a spiritual leader pushing the community to pursue growth through adversity, I think that looks like different types of ideas of meeting together that we can pursue. I think that you can go to what is the Friday thing called again? The Fun Fridays. I think that is incorrect.
Happy hour.
Happy hour. Yeah, happy hour Fridays. I think that is one of them. I think that this Sunday going to the park with your dogs or your kids, I think that's something where we're building back worship in little steps and just gathering together and being vulnerable, gathering together and just having fun. Both of those things are things that can build up our worship. And then the bureaucracy side, also scary. Bureaucracy is weird. God worked through worldly governing structure to aid his people, and God can do that for us. And I think that's something that we can pray for, because that's a God thing. That is a God thing only. And hoping for it is still worth it. Praying for it is still worth it. So we see that God does work this way. And I think that he can for us as well. So those are my encouragements, is to kind of investigate how prophecy, how spiritual leaders who are pushing us to rebuild different forms of worship, and bureaucracy, God working kind of bureaucratic miracles can help us in this season slowly rebuild. And we get to keep thinking about that. We get to keep thinking about that next week as we meet together, which is another form of us building back up. We're meeting in person, and I won't be able to see all of your faces, and I will be sad about that, but I will be really happy to see my pods faces in person, and I hope that you are happy to see your own pods faces in person, or the virtual pod, getting to go on a different level with each other. Yeah, get excited, guys. Get excited to investigate how we can keep pursuing worship.